Now I leave the floor to Professor Maurilo Matos Mendonça from Unisul Virtual, Director of International Relations Office.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I cannot start my presentation without first thanking Università degli Studi Guglielmo Marconi and the Guide Association for the warm welcome that they always give us, and it's a pleasure to be here for the third time. I am here this morning to share with you and to give you a teaser of what is approached in the second chapter of this guide publication. So the second chapter is made up of 5 articles, and I'm going to talk about the last 3 ones, and after that I'm going to hand the floor to my colleague, Josimara Roesler. So, let's start with the first one. It's the article that talks about quality in the learning process, evaluation of the didactic software, by Professor Enzo Moreira and Professor Angelita Marçal Flores from Unisul Virtual, Brazil, which is the institution I work for. This article has a focus on distance education mediated by the ICTs. It brings an analysis of the environment where distance education takes place, and is also an investigation of teacher training and management through the continuous exchange of knowledge, skills, and attitudes acquired during the process itself. In order to bring a view of this issue, they talk about the specific case of Unisul Virtual. Unisul Virtual is the face-to-face campus, so to speak, of University of Southern Santa Catarina, which works with both face-to-face education, with distance education, and blended learning as well. So in the case of Unisul Virtual, the VLS is the supporting platform for distance education, using digital communication resources to mediate learning. And online teaching is a core element of the virtual learning system. There are different ages in the VLS responsible for technical and pedagogical support and delivery of distance courses, and they are program coordinators, teacher trainers and counselors, course material authors, teachers, students, student and teacher support team, all working in consonance. The investments in teacher training at Unisul, they are permanent and began very long before the first open distance learning program was in place. And as a result of that, the Unisul Virtual teachers' level of competence can be said to be outstanding. I'm going to present to you very briefly, and I'm not going to go into detail so that you can get a little more curious and therefore acquire the publication and read it in more detail. But here, I'm going to present quickly the Unisul Virtual Teacher Training Model, and the first part of it is the Introductory Teacher Training Program for distance teaching. The teachers who go through this program get to know the VLS functions available for students and tutors. They get to understand the interactions among the tools in use in the VLS. Awareness is raised of the participants involved and their roles in distance education. They also get to understand the Unisul Virtual tutorial system. Awareness is raised as to the teacher's role in distance education, and there's also the development of knowledge of distance education courses assessment processes. After a teacher goes through this prep course, introductory course, they fill in a questionnaire after their first experience as distance teacher for research purposes, and the data are compiled, analyzed, and the results serve for constant improvement of our distance education practices and methods. The second part of this model is the continuing. The first was the introductory, and now is the continuing teacher training program for distance teaching. There are various aspects approached here, and one of them is continuing education program for assessments in distance education. The topics approached in this program are assessment of learning, collaborative activities, feedback on open distance learning, and how to elaborate or how to design objective and subjective questions for distance learning. Another aspect tackled by this program is continuing education program for distance teachers qualification. And the points approached are case study, reflections on the subject, written language to be used in online tutoring, distance teaching seminars at Unisul Virtual, how to moderate a virtual learning community, which has its particularities and intricacies, adults teaching learning processes from the perspective of distance education, and how to give feedback in distance education models, and finally, strategies for a quality virtual teaching. Still in the second program, continuing teacher training program, we have continuing education program for multimedia in distance education, and the topics approached in this program are expertise in using Adobe Presenter, video profile recording, basic notions for audio and video production, the use of multimedia to make the virtual classroom more dynamic, storyboard production for multimedia, multimedia learning objects production, and the use of Adobe Connect for web conferences, all of these tools to make the virtual learning environment a more humane environment and also dynamic. As regards the pedagogic support and follow-up to teachers in distance education, there are three main actions developed in this program, and because of time constraints, I cannot go into detail, but you can read about it in the book. And these actions are preventive, remedial or corrective, and teacher support, and we have the teacher support team. And the fourth program is teacher performance rating in distance education. How do we evaluate the teacher's performance, considering that they are being constantly monitored and supported by the teacher supporting team? So there are a series of aspects which are taken into consideration as follows. Number of unanswered questions in the teacher tool, days of delay in responding to questions. We strongly emphasize at Unisul that the ideal is for one student to wait for, 48 hours for an answer, but ideally no longer than 24 hours. There's also the number of days without posting a message on the message board tool, number of unmarked assignments, days of delay in making assignments and giving students feedback on their assignments, date of the last email sent to the students, amount of complementary or additional material published in the media library tool. There are also qualitative parameters used to evaluate teacher performance, and unfortunately I cannot talk about them now because of our time constraints, but you can read them in the book. The second topic, or the second article, which it's part of this chapter, which I'm going to talk about, is the Cloud Learning Challenge, Experiential and Intangible Learning in the New Didactic Models, written by Dr. Paolo Francesconi della Università degli Studi Guglielmo Marconi from Italy. In this article, Paolo Francesconi raises awareness and raises concern and contextualizes the issue of cloud learning through the following topics. He draws attention to the fact that traditional distance or e-learning models can no longer respond solely for the open, nomadic, and ubiquitous knowledge building processes made possible by the cloud computing infrastructures. He also points out that it's possible to measure and assess this new kind of intangible knowledge available with no time and space constraints or boundaries. He asks the question, is it possible to measure and assess this kind of knowledge? And he also talks about knowledge which can be generated and accessed anytime and anywhere. There is no doubt that this is a great development in modern times, but there's also the risk of an out-of-control learning process to take place. Now, as regards the planning, implementation, and delivery of cloud learning training, he points out that as the 2.0 didactics emerges, so does the need to plan and develop learning paths and contents that can be evaluated from both a qualitative and quantitative perspective as regards the efficacy of the knowledge acquired and the competencies developed. He stresses that it is important to understand how to organize content planning, implementation, and delivery in digital environments with no time and space constraints. And finally, he says that he points out and stresses and emphasizes that the fragmentation of learning objects calls for appropriate recording and coding criteria based on the semantic potentiality of the web. So he suggests the use of tags and meta tags to put this cloud in order, so to speak. And the last point raised is that cloud learning moves from a traditional transmission-use learning approach to innovative and collaborative solutions where teachers and students work together to build and improve shared knowledge repositories. Then he moves on to talk about the specific case of experientiality and inclusiveness in the virtual labs. The specific subject here are the virtual labs. Virtual labs are a significant experience in 2.0 didactics in that they provide immersive learning, a full learning subjective experience with multisensory interaction. Virtual labs follow a didactic model called mastery learning based on 5 main stages, namely establishment of objectives, division of contents in meaningful units, technical and methodological structuring of the teaching activities, inclusion of the midterm exams to create possible individualized learning paths, and the development of a final and comprehensive exam. And he also goes on to explain that the fundamental elements of mastery learning are that we should have realistic results in relation to the student's initial condition, that learning is delivered in a gradual and sequential way, and evaluation has to be used as correction instead of a selection tool. So this is the way, this is the path that we should follow in order to achieve tangible learning. This kind of learning, we all know is virtual. It's not real, but it has to be as realistic as possible. An experience, and it has to be a way for students to go through experience that would otherwise be inaccessible. He also talks about that there has to be a careful didactic design in order to provide a true learning experience free from cognitive risks. And the didactic design will take into account intangible factors related to cognitive experience, such as perception, imagination, intuition, and verisimilitude. The virtual lab planning guidelines have to be observed. The guidelines are described in the book in detail. And finally, he wraps up by saying that despite, this is a consideration that he writes in his article, that despite the massive spread and use of technologies, today's technocracy cannot disregard the need for careful didactic planning, humanistic approach, and student-centered methods as instructional design techniques as the basis for efficient, results-oriented distance learning paths. And the last topic I'm going to talk about is open educational resources, freeing up access to learning, the role for open educational resources, written by me, by Dr. Patrick McAndrew from the Open University UK and Dr. Andrea Inamorato dos Santos, also from the Open University. I would like to start with a brief, this article is nothing but a brief record of the OER movement, Open Educational Resources movement, and an overview of the current state of affairs. In 2002, during the Forum of the Impact of OpenCourseware for Higher Education in Developing Countries, the term open educational resources was coined. And a definition that is widely accepted is as follows. Open educational resources are teaching, learning, and research resources that reside in the public domain or have been released under an intellectual property license that permits their free use or repurposing by others. Open educational resources include full courses, course materials, modules, textbooks, streaming videos, tests, software, and any other tools, materials, or techniques used to support access to knowledge. And now I'm going to talk briefly about the OER movement and the movement of OER from the Web 1.0 to the Web 2.0 and beyond. When the Web 1.0 was released, the open educational resources played an important role in the dissemination of educational content, but that content was transmitted top-down from providers to users. With the advent of the Web 2.0, the tools which allowed the creation of a culture of interaction, exchange, and participation began to be in place. Such tools enable a multi-directional type of provision of information where one can be a user, reuser, and provider of information at the same time. Likewise, and because of that also, multi-directional ways of approaching education arise. So the internet has obviously widened access to a plethora of resources, including educational materials. With that in mind, a series of OER initiatives have been launched over the past few years which have laid down the foundations and provided alternatives that diversify the ways in which education is delivered and the learning is supported. Web 2.0 based open educational resources could make room for a dynamic knowledge exchange process to take place as it opens doors to collaborative processes. This raises great expectations and offers many educational possibilities. How do you find out about OER? How do you get to have access to OER? Here are some OER search resources which you can start using, such as Durham Discovered, OCW Finder, OER Commons, and others. Some key sites are the MIT OpenCourseWare, the Connections from Rice University, the OpenLearn project from the Open University UK, and the OpenCourseware Consortium run by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, of which I am a member of the board of directors. And I would like to take this opportunity to invite you all for the joint conference held by OCWC and OER 11 next April in the beautiful campus of Cambridge, England. And there are other projects, like the projects with physics simulations, TESSA, which is teaching in sub-Saharan Africa, WikiWidges, which is a project from the Netherlands, and others, Universia in Spanish and Portuguese. How do we make OER, open education, is open? It's very important, that we have to raise awareness to the use of open licenses. There is an assumption that if materials are can be accessed on the web, so then everything is permitted, but we know that it's not like that. We know, I think you are all familiar with the Creative Commons license. It provides a method to specify the permission for use. And the main attributes of this license, which is written in understandable language, not lawyer language, are attribution, non-commercial, limiting the rights for change and resources, and no derivatives. I am almost finishing. Many important aspects of OER are related to use and reuse, and they are limited or influenced by language, translation, localization, cultural and cross-cultural issues, and also sustainability. Sustainability of OER initiatives is a very important issue nowadays, and it's directly related to the survival of OER projects. Sustainability can be incentive-based, based on the premise that people can also do volunteer work, and also the funding-based sustainability, that is money. Here I will leave you some food for thought, or as Beatriz, my colleague, said, some open conclusions or things for you to think about. That in a not too distant future, universities may start conducting paid-for assessment for non-formally acquired knowledge. That there is an increasing need for efforts towards an effective articulation between formal and informal learning, that OER can help to respond to individuals' educational needs and aspirations, as OER do not impose admission barriers, tuition fees, or fixed learning paths. Nevertheless, OER still have a long way to go before they achieve widespread audiences. And in terms of research, it is important to identify and understand how, where, when, why, and if OER are being used or not, and their impacts on users. So I would like to thank you, and now I will hand the floor floor to my colleague Josimara Roesler. She will speak in Portuguese and I will translate. Thank you very much.